All right. So, good morning. Today, I wanted to give you guys a bit of a lesson on how to work with files, specifically text files with Python. So, in Python, we've got tons of flexibility and things that we can do with it. And one of the key things that makes it really simple in Python is working with text files. And but that makes it so much easier to do a lot of things. Working with persistent data. What I mean by persistent data means we can store data, store values in a file so that we don't have to enter the data again every time we run our program. With previous programs where you've asked the user for their name at the beginning and we use it later on in the program, we might want to ask for a bunch of different information. But the moment we quit the program, that data is lost. It's gone. And the next time we open it and run it again, we're going to have to re-enter all of that data. Well, being able to store data in a file, a text file, makes that a lot easier because we can simply retrieve that data from that file and work with it. And we don't need to have the user of our program re-enter all of that data. So the functions that they have built into Python to work for files are really simple. And I'm going to demo them now. I was thinking about what kind of a program we could make, and I don't really have a game necessarily right now, and I don't want to complicate this, but let's just say we wanted to make a high score table and store that in a file so that every time somebody opens and runs the game, it would record their score in the high score table and show it to them. All right, that way it doesn't clear it out every time that they restart the game. Now to start this, I want to demonstrate what some of the basic functions are. All right, and the main function we're going to use is open. And as you can see in Visual Studio Code, it brings up a whole bunch of parameters. Some are required, some are optional. Okay. At the very minimum, you need to have a string that refers to a file. Now, what we can do here, I'm going to call it my data file .txt because we're working with text files. Okay. Now, and the second parameter is going to be a letter, and it's going to be what permission you want Python to have working with this file. How do we want to work with it? And our options are either to read or to write. There's additional ones like append, but I'm going to get into that later. The simplest permissions are reading and writing. What operations we're going to perform with the file. And so to start with, I'm going to open it for writing. The reason for that is that if that file doesn't exist, and it's going to look for it relative to this script, and so it's going to look for a file called mydatafile.txt within the directory of files lesson. Right now that file doesn't exist, but if we open it with write and we write to it, it will actually create that file. And so here, to write data into it, I'm just going to do a really basic hello world, and then after you're done working with a file, we want to make sure that we close it. All right, and that's it. That's it for opening it and creating it. And so we run it. It doesn't show us anything, but we didn't tell it to print anything. But now if we go, we should be able to see a file. Here we are, my data file. Now, you might be wondering, why did the file show up here instead of in the directory with the script? And that's because Visual Studio Code, it uses its directory relative to which one you've chosen to open. And so that's why it's really important that you choose your directory of the project you're working on. It's going to reference all of your image files, text files, and all of that relative to which folder you choose to open first at the beginning. Okay, now we've got this, and watch what happens if we run it. That now it will create that text file within this directory right there. And if we click on it, we see it's written hello world. And notice that if I run this a second time, let's say I just do that, and I change what it says there, it doesn't retain the first hello world, which tells us that myfile.write actually wipes it and writes new data to it. And that's important to remember, because if you are writing multiple times to a file, every time you write to it, close it, open it, and write to it again, you are wiping it and populating it with your new data. Okay. If we want to retain that data, we can just change this to an A, which stands for append. And now let's just change this to something else. And let's see what's in there now. Now we've got hello there. Do you notice that as we append, it appends it right to the end, and it doesn't add any line breaks. It doesn't put it on the next line. If we wanted to do that, what we would have to do is put a /n in front of our new data and then run it. And there we go. So now obviously this isn't that useful, and if we were to put these into some procedures, it would make things a lot simpler. So let's do that. So let's make a function for reading data, because now that it's there, we haven't been reading. All we've been doing is writing. So I'm going to make a function called read data, and I'm going to have it pass in file name, and I'm just using my file. You can use any variable name. It doesn't actually matter what it is. And what we're doing is when we do open, open is returning that file object, which we can apply and call many different methods on it, like write and close, and it stores it in that variable there. And so now that I'm going to create this function, so I'm passing file name in. I'm not going to explicitly put in the name of the file. I'm going to put file name, comma, and then R for read. Okay. Now it's important to note that if this file doesn't exist, this line is going to give us an error. Okay. And so after this, I'm going to show you how we can do make a function to check if a file actually exists or not. Okay. So here we go. My file equals open, file name for read, and now there's a couple other methods that we can use to retrieve it into data structures that we like to work with, like lists. So I'm going to make a new variable. All lines is equal to myfile.readLines. And now all lines is going to be a list, and what it will do is it will take each line in the file and store that as a separate item in a list. Okay, so let's just what I'm going to do for this function is just return all lines, and let's just remove all of this. I'm going to make at the very top of my code, I'm going to make a variable called file name, and it's going to be called mydatafile.txt. And I encourage you to do it this way. If you're working with files, make a variable near the top of your code, kind of as a config area, where you can specify once the name of the file, store it in a variable, and then forever after, in the rest of your program, refer to the variable name. And the reason for that is that if you were to put explicit strings throughout your code and then later on decide, you know what, I want to change the name of that file name, you're going to have to change it in every single place. Whereas if we make a variable, we can just change the name of it right at the top in one place, and then the whole rest of our program will adjust because we're referring to the variable. Okay. We can even use this to make a program where we get the name of the file from the user, get it through input, we could check if the file exists, and store it in a variable, and then continue on with our program, and that would work great. So now I'm going to make a variable line data equal to read data file name, and finally let's print line data. Now let's see how that works. And as you can see down here, we've got a list with two elements. The first one is that really long line, and it's a string because of the quotes. And the second string is just hello there. Notice at the end of the line is that /n. And so we're also going to need to make a function to strip those out, those /n's. But as I said before, we were going to make a function to see if the file exists. Now let's try that. So I'm going to call it check file exists, file name, and to check if it exists, I'm going to make use of a try except. So here, a try, what that does, if you've never used a try except, it's really useful in Python. It essentially allows you to put commands in there that you know could possibly result in an error. But that's a problem, because if it does result in an error, your program stops. And for a user, you don't want their program to stop. You want them to be able to continue using it, even if there's an action that results in an error. So we're going to use a try here. And essentially, I'm just going to copy in there and do a read on it. And if that's true, then I'm going to return true. If this line though gives us an error, line 5, then it's not going to return true. It should break before that and skip down to the except. So this function basically just gives us a Boolean. True if it works, false if it doesn't. All right. And so let's call that inside here. So we're going to go if check file exists, file name, then do all of that. Else, let's print that file does not exist. So if I do it once, let's see if that works. We've got our list. Now what if we change this to a file name we know doesn't exist? That file does not exist. None. Now why are we getting none there? And that's because we're printing here, we're not returning, and yet what we're doing here is trying to print the return value of read data. So what I should be doing here is, rather than doing a print, is I should be returning the string that file does not exist, and it will get printed down here. Here we go. And now we've got a pretty good error checking here to check if a file exists. Now let's make a new function for writing data. Let's write data. Let's put data here, file name, pass those in. And so, and rather than write, just because write has the association of wiping and replacing the data, let's just call it add. And so what I want to do is append on to our file those things. Now, what I should also be doing is making sure that when I'm done working with a file, I should be closing it. So right here, I should be closing those files. Let's go back here. So now my file equals open file name and I'm going to open it for appending, and then let's just go myfile.write data and adds it in. myfile.close. Make sure you close it. All right. Now we were going to make a high score table here. So let's just make a real simple one where we have it write the names of people and their scores, and then maybe the order at the beginning of what position they're in. Okay. Now we need to think about how this is going to work, because the order in that position should swap. If there's a new high score. So let's just change this up. So rather than add high score, well, never mind. Let's leave that there. What I would recommend is before we write our data, we should be doing all of our sorting, getting into the right order, and that beforehand. Okay. Now, in order to do that, we should be working with lists, and then we're going to want to parse or create our own method of writing each line in our text file, so that we have all the separate pieces of information: the position, the name, and the score. Okay. So I'm just going to put in a comment here an example entry. Okay. And what I'm thinking of is something like 1 meaning the position, the name, and then the score. So let's say this is 2500, something like that. Okay. And then another example might be 2. Like that. And so that might be the second line. All right. So we've got our read data, we've got our checking if file exists, we've got our add data. So in order for us to have a high score table, maybe what I'll do is I'm going to first populate it manually with some example entries. All right. So I've got some entries. Now let's grab those and then parse it. So I'm going to make old data equal to read data file name. So that should grab it and throw it into a list, and now all data should have that list. Yes? Now let's parse that. Now what we want to use to be able to parse it, because notice I made a separator. I used a colon as a separator. Now the reason I did that is so that each line could be grouped together. Those are associated with each other, the position, the name, and the value. But I put a separator in there so that I can separate these out. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make an empty list. And for each item in the list, I'm actually going to make use of a dictionary for this, because I think that makes sense. We've got a separate, that way we can categorize each of the values. Okay, so I'm going to make a for loop for line in all data. So now I'm iterating through this list. All right, maybe we should just make sure before I continue on that this is actually working. Let's just print all data. Should we? Okay, so there we go. We've got our list with our 4 strings, and oh, we've got those slash ends in there still. I almost forgot. We need to get rid of that. You know what? I'm gonna make my function for that. I'm gonna call it clean data, and I'm just going to pass in my list. So data will be a list, and for item in data, actually, let's change that. For x in range, length data. And the reason why I want to change this up is because I want to be able to update the value of each item in data. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a replace method on each item. So I'm going to go data x is equal to data x dot replace /n with that. Replace is really nice. It's a string method that looks for whatever string you put in this first parameter, and it replaces it with whatever you put in the second parameter. So I'm using it to find any /n's and replacing it with an empty string, nothing. Okay. After I've done that, let's return data. So right after this, I can make all data equal to clean data and pass all data in. Let's see if that works to clean my data. And beautiful, look at that. All the /n's are gone. All right. So that's a really useful function right there. I hope you're also seeing how I'm making use of these functions so that later on it makes my program so much cleaner. I'm not copying and pasting and doing this multiple times. All I have to do is call my new function that I created, and that's lovely. So now let's get back to what we were doing. What did we want to do? We want to populate our high scores with all of the data separated out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to append to our high scores a dictionary. So I'm going to do that with curly braces here, and I'm going to go position, and the value of that is going to be, actually, before I append, let's separate it out. I'm jumping ahead of myself. What we can do here, I believe, is make 3 variables here. position name score equals to line dot split colon. Let's see if that works. So if I print position name score dot format and then pass in the values of my three variables. Let's see if it separates that out. What I did here with line.split is for line in all data, so we're iterating through, we're splitting that string according to the separator that I used, the colon. And what that should do is give us a list. It should give us a list, but separate it out into these three variables. I have a feeling I may have done it wrong here, but let's try it out anyways. Oh, actually that worked beautifully. Look at that. So by setting, because I know that each line is going to be having three values as a result after we split it, I can just specify my variable names in front here, and it will assign each of them their appropriate values. So that's beautiful. So now, after I've got those separate variables, now let's make our new dictionary and append it into our list. So I'm going to go position and then name and finally score. And just to remind you, with dictionaries, we're looking for a key value pair. And so I've just appended an item in, and the item is a dictionary with three values, three parameters, or three keys with the corresponding value of position, name, and score. Here we go. Now let's print high scores after that. Let's see what happens. All right. Beautiful. And so then if we wanted to print, let's say we wanted to print the second person's name, their position, and their score. And let's do that. So name, and I'm just going to use a /n there. Position, and score. Dot format name. Actually, what I want to pass in there then is high scores at index 1, because that will be the second value. And then in another square brackets, now I can put in the key. I want name. There we go. So that's going to be how we reference the name of the second item. Now I want position. And finally, I want score. If you're wondering why I'm doing this two sets of square braces, the first one indicates which dictionary in our list we want to grab, and I want to do it index 1 because, remember, index values start at 0. The second one is which key, which value do we want to grab? We want to grab the value associated with name. So finally, let's see if that works. And there we go. We've got Piper positioned at position 2 is score 1800. All right, beautiful. So now that we've got this, and essentially what we're doing here is populating a high scores, let's put this into a function. Make it easy. Grab high score table. Let's pass in file name. We can get rid of this now. And we should be able to there we go. Just put that right in there. So all data is reading it, which also checks first if it exists and then returns our list. Now we're cleaning the data. Now we're making the high scores empty list. I don't necessarily need to print it. Now we are appending, populating our high scores list. And finally, we're going to return our high scores list. Okay, so now we've just made a bunch of functions, and down at the bottom, let's actually call it by going high score. I'm going to make a variable high score table, and I'm going to make it equal to grab high score table file name. And if I print my high score table, we should see our whole list right there. Beautiful. Now obviously this is not well commented out, and so you should be commenting as you go, which I wasn't a very good example of. And this checks if the file exists. If not, returns false. Returns true if file exists, etc. Okay, so that's about it for this lesson. We've gone over how to read data from a file, how to check if a file exists and make use of a nice function there, how to read data from a file and put it and populate it into a list of values. We've added data to a file, appending it at the end of it. We've also cleaned our data so that we've can remove all of those /n's. And then finally, we've been able to grab it, populating a list with a dictionary so that it's really useful later on. Okay, being able to grab individual names, positions, and scores. In the next video, I'm going to be adding in how do we add additional high scores into here, as well as getting it into the right position. All right, but that's it for today. Thanks.